Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us tonight Judge Tom ENGEL, who comes from the Empire State, I'd say of the country. You're in the Empire State of the South now, Tom. Is there any doubt in your mind about that?
Well, no wonder I feel comfortable.
Well, it's great to have you here. I know you've visited us before. And when we have our conversations, we often discuss the centrifugal forces that are afoot in the world. Now, there have been some interesting events in New York State recently. I mean, could you elaborate on that? I mean, I think you lost your governor. What happened exactly?
Well, New York, it will come as no surprise to you and your viewers that it's one of the most solidly democratic states in the Union, and New York City is certainly 100% or almost 100% Democratic these days. And thus it came as something of a surprise to many that we lost our Democratic governor, Andrew Cuomo, who has been governor for the last 11 years.
Yes.
And he was forced to resign despite having solid Democratic majorities in both the state Senate and the state Assembly. And his successor is a rather obscure Western New York Lieutenant Governor, Kathy Hochul, and Mr. Cuomo is gone. That really was the result of three separate investigations into wrongdoing. The first, which is actually the most serious, is a federal investigation into his having filed false statements with the federal government for reimbursement of Medicare and Medicaid expenses with respect to the numbers of people who were put in nursing homes and during the beginning of the COVID emergency and pandemic. And it's a federal investigation. It's in Brooklyn. Because it's federal, it's serious, and because it involves state unlawful filings of materials with the federal government, it's going to be not that difficult to prove. I think it will be more difficult to prove that the governor knew about this or authorized it, but that's the way the federal investigation will work. Is
Yes.
They will simply flip the lower people who will then testify against the higher up people,
Yes.
who will then be flipped and testify against the higher up people, who will then testify against the governor. That's the most serious of the investigations. A second one involves his use of federal employees, state of New York employees, for the publication of a memoir that he wrote last year and got a $5 million advance from, I think, Simon and Schuster.
Yes.
And he used apparently state personnel on weekends and nights to help him put that book together, and then realized a small fortune in the advance. And when that came to light, the book was pulled by Simon & Schuster, and I think is no longer available. So that's pretty serious as well. And also not that difficult to prove, because you just call them the state employees and you say, what were you doing on the weekend of March 27 and 28, 2020?
Yes, yes.
And then they describe working for Governor Cuomo's book, and then they asked him, well, did that involve work on behalf of New York State at all? And they say no. And therefore, the governor used state employees for his own personal benefit. The third investigation, which was in some ways the least serious, became, however, the most telling, and that was his so-called sexual advances or romantic advances on as many as 13 different women. I think it's fair to say that some of the advances were pretty insignificant.
Yes.
And his lawyer has recently come out and said that there weren't anything like 13, although she was forced to, I think, concede that there were several.
Yes.
But the most serious of those was where he had a female New York State trooper who had apparently worked in his vicinity at some point, and he had her transferred to his personal detail, so that she worked with the governor and for his security.
Yes.
In a small team, and he was often alone with her, and even while she was in uniform,
yes,
he caressed her and made her feel uncomfortable, and touched her in inappropriate sexual ways. But there were several others,
yes, yes,
as well. And so that was the one that really felled him. Because the women were going to take it out on him, and the men in the state assembly who would launch the impeachment,
yes,
were really powerless to stop it.
right.
Even though I think, at least in my judgment, the other two investigations were more, shall we say, substantive.
Now, Tom, but these character defects appearing in a politician in New York State, should one be shocked that things like this have transpired in the Empire State? Certainly in Georgia, we have our issues here, and it's let him without sin cast the first stone in the political community. Certainly, there's plenty of knavery to go around everywhere. But was these exceptional events in New York State?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, he was very ambitious and wanted to outshine his father, who had served 3 complete terms and was running for a 4th term when he was defeated by my good law school friend at Columbia Law School, George Pataki.
Yes.
So there was an overweening ambition to outshine his father. And then the second thing that was active there, I think, was that he had a longtime girlfriend whose name I've forgotten, but they lived together in a home in Westchester. I think it was in Westchester, and I think it was her home. And they split up, maybe about 2 years ago.
Yes.
And so all of a sudden he didn't have a woman in his life, and that may have made him more than usually sexually suggestive.
So the great bull was in the pasture, sort of running amok, and then
Right.
Actually he was a figure of some notoriety in the middle of the pan epidemic and was touted as possibly a presidential candidate.
Yeah, I think he would have loved to have been reelected as New York State governor, and then tried his hand in 2024. Because he had his own little TV show during the whole COVID thing, and because he was laughably given an Emmy Award for his for these half-hour programs that he broadcast daily, he had acquired a certain amount of notoriety, and I think was riding high, but. The interesting thing about it, I would say, is that once these accusations began to kind of pile up and take on a life of their own, he had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, because none of the people around him would support him or stand up for him or defend him in any way, because he was such a nasty SOB that he didn't have any friends. anywhere in the circle. He was just a nasty, pushy, manipulative guy who always wanted his own way. So when the blank hit the fan, there was nobody there to protect him or help him.
You know, those defects you outlined, are those positive attributes for a politician? I mean, it was mean, selfish, whatever other sort of, apparently that's that occupation often attracts people with some kind of flaws, secret or otherwise. And politicians, I think, are that way in many places, many states, everywhere. A narcissistic personality sort of is that's good energy to be a politician, and the narcissistic personalities have all these problems attached to it. It would appear to me that just to ask the question, there's a certain hypocrisy about the whole story with politics. Many people that supported him and were his alleged friends, when he fell from grace, he was abandoned. But there must have been people who must have known these defects were in evidence. I'm sure there were stories that circulated, and indeed, if you had your ear to the ground in Albany, New York, and you were listening to stories about the political representatives, I'm sure that many a tale that's undercover right now.
I'm sure that's right. You know, and politicians, of course, have a almost universal weakness of believing their own BS.
Yes.
And an almost universal weakness of living in the sunshine and loving it. But also with politicians, something that goes with that frequently is charm. And a genuine sense of what other people are thinking and trying to get them in the most natural way to be a follower or a fan of say, Governor Cuomo. But he didn't operate that way. He was an autocrat, and he didn't have charm. And he was going through the motions, I think, to emulate a father that actually did have some charm.
Oh, did he?
Yeah.
Well, we could, persist with, we could discuss some Georgia politicians, but let us continue with New York. I believe the mayor de Blasio is departing, and with some bit of controversy around his stay as the mayor of New York City.
Yeah, well, he was term limited.
Yes. And
this was the end of his second term, so he had no choice but to move on. I mentioned, I think, earlier that Mr. de Blasio's real name is Warren Wilhelm, which is German, and I think that de Blasio comes from his mother's maiden name. So
he altered his name. It sounds sort of threatening. Walter, what's it, Wilhelm?
Wilhelm, yeah.
Wilhelm.
And obvious German extraction.
Wilhelm, what would that mean in German?
William.
Helm is home?
William.
Oh, it means William.
Wilhelm means William.
William.
And I'd never, I think, experienced in my lifetime as a longtime resident of New York for basically my whole life, except when I was away at school, as a politician more universally reviled and despised than de Blasio. And I mean on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats. I don't know anyone who has a good word to say about him. It is rumored that he will seek higher office and run for governor, perhaps against Ms. Hochul.
Yes.
Who is now in that seat. And he's, I think, apparently said as much. He just thinks that he'll have a large following among, straight ticket voters in the Democratic New York City. But I think it's possible that, given the the odor that has been left by Cuomo and to some extent de Blasio, that a Republican might have a real chance in New York. Of course, it would all depend on turnout.
Well, are there Republicans? Let's discuss that a little bit. I mean, can states say, well, we have this country that's been split into red and blue states, and a blue state will always elect a Democrat, or a red state, a Republican. That's the way it is. There's no chance. There's no real two-party system. Maybe somewhat in purple states. That doesn't seem like that's good for the Republic. I mean, if in fact no one has a chance. I think in Georgia we've certainly elected some Democratic senators here, and
yeah, that came as a surprise.
Did it?
Yeah, at least to me, being from New York. Yeah,
there's some complexities about what a voter turnout, who votes for whom, and I think it's good to have politicians under a little voter threat, so to speak. The voters are watching what they're up to.
You can see that being acted out right now in the Congress with Senator Manchin of West Virginia and Senator Sinema of Arizona.
Yes.
President Trump carried West Virginia, got 69% of the vote.
Yes, it's a very conservative state.
In 2020. And however, as a very conservative state, they have elected plenty of Democrats over the years, including the redoubtable Robert Byrd, who you may recall.
Yes.
But now you have people like the Majority Leader Schumer in the Senate belittling these two senators who hold the absolute key to passing this outrageous, or I guess outlandish, legislation that the president has put before the body of trying to gin up $3.5 trillion to do something, 100 things that I think America really doesn't need. And instead of having discreet and sensitive conversations with them, he's allowed people like Bernie Sanders to go out and bully them and say that two senators cannot be allowed to frustrate the will of 48 senators.
Yes.
But of course, there are another 50 senators on the Republican side, so it's actually 52 senators, not two senators.
Yes.
That's yet to be played out. We'll see how, whether Manchin and Sinema can be gotten to compromise at around a figure of, say, 2 trillion or 1.8 or 9. That's what one hears, and so that'll be interesting to see.
Well, now I guess the dangers that are obviously it's a very changeable world. A lot of things happening. A lot of events are underway. Maybe we could discuss the $3.5 trillion, which some people have said are $5 trillion. Exactly what's in it. And maybe there's some good things in there. There could be. But just to spell them out, that process doesn't seem to be happening. And certainly the danger is whatever the impact, increased taxation, government authority, and particularly inflation. It's quite worrisome. What happens to people, even if they're not taxed? Their income taxes don't go up, but nevertheless, inflation certainly is a tax, and it would appear from classic economics that there's a substantial chance we're headed for a period of inflation that would be worsened by this great spending campaign. And I think it's been said, well, we're going to take all this money with taxes. We're going to just take the taxes. And the question is, what's the best bang for the buck for a dollar bill in regards to whether private enterprise uses it, the government uses it. And I don't think there's going to be adequate balance that would prevent inflation. I think most people believe we're headed for that. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I'm not an economist, but I think that the the inflation we've seen in the last 6 or 8 months is certainly the most significant inflation that I've seen since the 1970s.
Well, were you alive at that point, Tom? I mean, you recollect that?
I was barely alive.
Yes, right.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, for much of that period, I was working for the government.
Yes.
As a federal prosecutor.
And I think you saw, I mean, as one of your interesting sidelights in your career was doing that. I mean, you certainly saw a lot of chicanery. Is that an understatement?
I sure did. But, you know, I can remember, as I'm sure you can, the long lines at the gas station.
Yes.
and the prices of particularly energy go absolutely through the roof during the Carter years. Another contribution of the great state of Georgia.
Well, that's right. We have many such contributions. Actually, many people might say he was one of our worst presidents, but has been our very best president after he's out of office. You could say that.
Well, I think he's at heart a good person, good man, but he was a little over his depth, I think. And I think Biden is over his depth. If I can change the subject a little bit.
Well, yes.
It's pretty clear he has lost a step or two mentally, and is cognitively challenged. On the one hand, he's set up this whole staging area in the executive office building, for example, where he goes and makes addresses to the country on various things, and it's all set up so that he can read his speech off of a television monitor or something very like that, instead of just one of these
yes.
Tapes above the lectern. And he is the shocking way that he has handled his presidency thus far, and we're only, I think, 8 months into it or something,
yes.
I don't think is going to be forgiven next year by the American people. And I think that we'll see what happens in the gubernatorial race in Virginia, which is coming up.
Yes.
In a few weeks, where this unknown Republican is challenging a former governor, and appears to be doing pretty well.
Yes.
And I'm quite certain with my own political pulse, if you will, that the 2022 midterm elections are going to be an unmitigated disaster for the Democrats. They will, I'm sure, lose the House, and probably lose the House by 60 seats. And I believe they will lose the Senate too, even though there are more Republican seats in play than Democrats. So I think it's going to be a real wake-up call. And I think the reasons for that, you know, everybody in the last few weeks has seen on their televisions every night. I'll lead with the Afghan affair. I mean, that was a complete and utter debacle for American prestige, for our role in the world, for our sense of allyship with our allies all around the world, and of course, most shockingly, for the lives of those 13 soldiers who were killed needlessly in the Air Force base at Kabul. Americans are not going to forgive that, and they are not going to forget it. I think the bet in the White House is that they won't remember it, but the shock which that caused Americans of whatever political stripe. I had many Democratic friends come up to me and say, just holding their heads, you know, I voted for Biden, but I can't believe what's going on there. That kind of thing. Long-time Democratic friends.
Yes.
The whole thing was a complete botch, and the military men have now, for better or for worse, testified in Congress that they told the president that they should leave as many as 2,500 and even 4,500 troops in country and continue to provide air support. But they didn't. The president stuck to his this idea that he was going to get out by September 11th, 20 years later. They closed the wrong airport. They closed Kabul
Yes.
instead of Bagram. They couldn't really provide any decent support from Kabul because it's a very small airport, and Bagram was instead evacuated in the middle of the night by American troops without telling anybody in Afghanistan. It was shocking. I mean, really shocking. It was just a complete abandonment of the people that we had set up in Afghanistan over 20 years, and a complete abandonment of England, France, Germany, and whatever allies were fighting with us there under the NATO umbrella.
Well, if you were to give the Democratic Party some advice, I mean, you've prophesied they're going to be torpedoed and sink. What advice would you give them? What would you say to turn the situation around?
Well, the first thing I would do is tell them to shut down the border. I mean, I think as shocking as Afghanistan was, the border is almost equally shocking. And you have people from all over the world, 150 different countries apparently, crossing with not so much as a by your leave, across the Texas border and the whole southern border with Mexico. Many of these people are sick with COVID. They are then taken by the Border Patrol and others, and they're put either in airplanes or on buses and sent and dispersed all across the United States. I mean, talk about a super carrier event. But quite apart from the COVID, you know, you just have this completely uncontrolled influx
Yes.
of foreigners whom we really don't know who they are. They are given some sort of summons that they're supposed to appear in front of some magistrate in 60 days. And I know from my own experience that they never show up,
Yes.
or fewer than 30% show up.
Yes, yes.
You know, that's no way to run a railroad. And I think Americans are, and I very much include Hispanic and African Americans in this group. I think they resent this as much as anyone.
Yes.
And I think, given the fact that Trump started to do quite well in the last election with Hispanic American men and African American men, that this is going to be a real problem for Biden going forward.
Well, that's one thing that you suggest. You have any other suggestions? Should they do something about their $3.5 trillion bill? Would they,
well,
if they backpedaled on that?
No,
would
I
that,
don't think, well, they're going to backpedal, I think, in order to get Manchin and Sinema aboard and compromise on the sheer amount of it. Or they're going to use this little trick of funding these programs for 5 years instead of 10 years.
Yes.
But I don't think Mr. Manchin is a person to be played with. He seems to know his own mind about this. And he wants to be reelected in West Virginia, and for all I know, run for president in 2024.
Well, that's a possibility, isn't it?
Yeah.
So people might be jockeying around. Well, assuming that it's going to be almost impossible for the Democrats to change their policies, although it would be in their best interest to do it. There's certainly, I would assume they'd be getting some advice about what could be done. It seems to be the major issue is the bigger this $3.5 trillion package can be, the more money that can be distributed, so much the better. That seems to be at least allegedly, the hope that they espouse in regards to the elections in the future. But that doesn't seem like it's going to work. My final question as we conclude our little interchange here is who actually is running the country right now? I mean, who do you think is doing it?
Well,
I mean, assuming that President Biden is, I will say, I had an article in the Atlantic about a dementia, what happens when you get older, what occurs with your mentation, should there be an age limit on presidents? And it certainly bears the thought that many of the older patients are president septuagenarians, have issues. You could say Ronald Reagan took naps. You could even say Donald Trump is up there in age that may be playing a role, and certainly President Biden, there seems to be some issues there. But if in fact he's reading his speeches, there's indications people are telling him what to do. Who is telling him what to do? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I think Susan Rice is clearly somebody who's doing that, as she did with Obama. And to the extent that Susan Rice is doing that, it wouldn't surprise me at all to learn that Susan Rice is taking her lead from the former President Obama, for that matter. Of course, in addition, there's this fellow named Ron Klain, K-L-A-I-N,
yes.
Who is a lawyer turned investment banker, who is, I think, the chief of staff. And there's another guy named Dave Emmett, something like that, who's also with the Obama administration. But I wouldn't be at all surprised to see people in and out of government now, but who were associated with the Obama administration pulling the strings.
Well, on that note, I think we can conclude our conversation. Well, I welcome you to Georgia, Tom. I hope you see
nice
you
to
some
be
more,
back.
and it's good to see you again. And we wish you well, and we actually wish all our fellow Americans in New York State that may all things be good for you up there. So thank you so much.
Likewise here in Georgia. Thank you.
Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.